Imagine a man so wealthy, he once famously said, "No man is truly rich unless he can maintain an entire army at his own private expense." This wasn't a modern defense contractor or a Silicon Valley disruptor. This was Marcus Crassus, over 2,000 years ago. We talk about the 1% today, but the elite of ancient Rome operated on a level of financial ruthlessness that would make even the most aggressive hedge fund manager shudder. They didn't just own land, they owned the law, the grain supply, and in some cases, the very fires that burned their rivals' homes. How did these titans build fortunes that lasted centuries without computers, central banks, or a global stock market? Today, we are opening the doors to the vault to reveal the devious, brilliant, and often deadly strategies used by Rome's richest men to dominate the ancient world's economy. From the world's first firefighting protection racket to the agricultural monopolies that fed an empire, we're looking at the receipts of history. Welcome to the Legacy Vault. Let's unlock the truth about the 1% of ancient Rome. Marcus Licinius Crassus once watched a building burn while calculating profit margins. Not rescue costs, profit margins. Because in Rome, you didn't call the fire brigade before negotiating the sale price of your property. Welcome to the economics of the ancient 1%, where fortunes weren't built on innovation or hard work, but on a level of ruthless exploitation that would make modern billionaires blush. These weren't just wealthy men. They were architects of systematic wealth extraction so efficient that comparing them to today's elite isn't just fair. It's actually generous to our modern rich. Let's start with Crassus, because his fire brigade scheme reveals something crucial about Roman wealth accumulation. Rome burned constantly. Wooden apartments stacked 7 stories high, oil lamps in every room, no building codes, and 0 fire departments. Fires were inevitable, catastrophic, and frequent. Most people saw tragedy. Crassus saw market opportunity. He assembled a private fire brigade, roughly 500 men trained and equipped at his own expense. Impressive civic contribution, right? Not exactly. Here's how it actually worked. Your apartment catches fire. Flames are spreading. Your family's screaming. Crassus arrives with his team, but they don't start working immediately. First, he makes an offer to purchase your property at a fraction of its value. You're standing there watching everything you own turn to ash, and this man in expensive robes is negotiating. Refuse his offer? His men stand there. They watch it burn. Accept his lowball price? They extinguish the flames. He owns your property, and you're suddenly homeless, but technically compensated. This wasn't entrepreneurship. This was weaponized emergency response. The brilliance was in the asset accumulation model. Crassus didn't just collect random properties. He strategically acquired entire city blocks, creating real estate monopolies in high-density areas. Once he controlled enough adjacent properties, he could dictate rents, force out competitors, and essentially own the economic lifeblood of entire neighborhoods. His estimated wealth? Ancient sources suggest around 200 million sesterces. Converting Roman currency is tricky, but modern economists estimate his wealth at roughly $2 billion in contemporary terms. And that's conservative. Some calculations push it closer to 10 billion when you factor in his land holdings, silver mines, and slave assets. But Crassus was just one player in a system designed for wealth concentration. Let's talk about grain, because controlling food supply meant controlling Rome itself. The grain trade was the oil industry of the ancient world. Rome imported massive quantities from Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily. The population needed it to survive. The state subsidized it to prevent riots, and a small group of families controlled it completely. These grain merchants didn't just sell food. They manipulated supply chains, hoarded inventory during shortages, and lobbied for favorable legislation that guaranteed their monopoly. The famous bread and circuses policy that kept Roman masses pacified? That was partially funded by grain merchants, who made fortunes selling to the state at inflated prices. The government bought grain, distributed it below cost to maintain social stability, and the patrician class pocketed the difference through layers of contractors and middlemen. It was a closed loop of public money flowing directly into private aristocratic hands, all while maintaining the appearance of civic generosity. Real estate tells an even darker story. Roman housing existed in two categories: the domus and the insula. The domus was a single-family home with courtyards, private rooms, and actual structural integrity. The wealthy lived there. The insula was a multi-story apartment building where the poor were stacked vertically in increasingly dangerous conditions. Ground floors were relatively safe and expensive. Top floors were fire traps with no running water, no heat, and structural integrity that would horrify modern engineers. Rent on these death traps consumed 50 to 70% of a working person's income. Patricians owned these buildings in portfolios, treating them as pure cash flow assets. Maintenance? Minimal. Safety improvements? Non-existent. When buildings collapsed, which happened regularly, the landlord class simply rebuilt and kept collecting rent. The economic model depended on keeping the lower classes perpetually on the edge of survival, earning enough to pay rent, but never enough to accumulate savings or escape the cycle. Here's what makes this system particularly insidious compared to modern wealth inequality. Today's billionaires at least operate within frameworks of corporate law, regulated markets, and theoretical accountability. Roman elites had none of those constraints. Crassus could let your home burn without legal consequence. Grain merchants could starve a city without antitrust violations. Landlords could collect rent on structurally unsound buildings that killed tenants, and the only recourse was hoping a different patrician might offer slightly better terms. The concentration of wealth reached levels that would be mathematically impossible in modern economies. Roughly 2,000 families controlled essentially all of Rome's productive assets: land, trade routes, mines, agricultural output, urban real estate. All of it funneled wealth upward through mechanisms designed specifically for extraction. Social mobility wasn't just rare, it was systemically blocked. You were born into your economic class, and barring military conquest or extraordinary political maneuvering, you died there. But here's what really matters about understanding Roman wealth. These weren't accidental fortunes or market anomalies. This was engineered inequality, built into every aspect of how Roman society functioned. The legal system protected property rights for the wealthy, while offering virtually no protections for the poor. Political offices required property qualifications, ensuring only the rich could legislate. Military service offered some upward mobility, but even that required initial capital for equipment. So when we talk about converting sesterces to dollars, we're not just discussing exchange rates. We're comparing entire economic philosophies. The Roman system wasn't capitalism with problems. It was extraction masquerading as civilization. Modern billionaires accumulate wealth through market dynamics that at least theoretically involve value creation. Jeff Bezos built logistics infrastructure. Elon Musk manufactures electric vehicles. You can debate their ethics, their labor practices, their tax avoidance, but there's a product, a service, something tangible being exchanged. Roman elites? They built nothing. They extracted everything. Let's get specific about what that extraction looked like in actual numbers. Marcus Licinius Crassus, at his death, held assets worth approximately 200 million sesterces. Converting ancient currency is notoriously imprecise, but using grain prices as a baseline gives us reasonable estimates. 1 modius of wheat, enough to feed one person for about a month, cost roughly 3 sesterces in stable periods. That means Crassus's wealth could purchase 66 million modii of grain, enough to feed the entire population of Rome for nearly 2 years. One man, 2 years of food for 1 million people. But raw numbers miss the real story. Wealth in Rome wasn't about consumption, it was about control. Crassus didn't need 200 million sesterces to live well. He needed it to own senators, fund private armies, and manipulate political outcomes. His wealth was a weapon, not a luxury. Every sesterce represented leverage over someone else's survival. The grain monopoly worked because Rome's food supply depended entirely on imports. Egypt and North Africa shipped grain across the Mediterranean to feed the city. A handful of families controlled those shipping contracts, the warehouse facilities, and the distribution networks. They didn't produce anything. They simply positioned themselves as mandatory intermediaries between farmers and consumers, extracting wealth at every transaction. When grain prices spiked, whether from legitimate shortages or artificial scarcity, the poor starved while merchants profited. The state stepped in with subsidized distributions, but guess who supplied that grain? The same merchants, now selling to the government at negotiated rates that guaranteed their margins. You're probably thinking this sounds familiar, and you'd be right. Modern agricultural conglomerates, pharmaceutical middlemen, defense contractors, they all operate on similar principles. Position yourself as an unavoidable intermediary, capture regulatory frameworks, and extract rent from transactions you don't actually improve. The Romans just did it without pretending to believe in free markets. Real estate inequality reached levels that defy modern comparison. Imagine paying 70% of your income for a fourth-floor apartment with no plumbing, no heat, and genuine risk of structural collapse. Now, imagine your landlord owns 300 identical buildings across the city, each packed with families in identical circumstances. That landlord never visits, never repairs, never improves. He simply collects. When your building burns down or collapses, he rebuilds the minimum viable structure and fills it again within months. The system doesn't require happy tenants. It requires tenants with no alternatives. And they had no alternatives. Rome's urban planning was designed to concentrate populations in high-density areas where land values benefited property owners. The city didn't sprawl outward with affordable housing options. It built vertically, stacking the poor in increasingly precarious conditions, while the wealthy maintained sprawling estates both in the city and across the countryside. Geographic mobility was restricted by both legal status and economic reality. If you were born in Rome without property, you died in Rome without property, paying rent to the same families for your entire existence. Converting sesterces to modern dollars requires choosing what to measure. By grain prices, Crassus's fortune equals roughly $10 billion. By average wage comparisons, it's closer to $50 billion. By percentage of GDP, he controlled wealth equivalent to $150 billion in today's economy. But these conversions miss the fundamental difference. Modern billionaires exist within systems that at least theoretically constrain their power. Antitrust laws, labor regulations, progressive taxation. These create friction, however inadequate. Roman elites faced no such constraints. Their wealth was absolute, their power unchecked, their extraction unlimited. The Patrician class didn't just own assets. They owned the legal framework that defined property rights. They owned the political system that enforced contracts. They owned the military force that protected their interests. When wealth concentration reaches that level, you're no longer talking about inequality. You're talking about oligarchy functioning as designed. So when you hear about ancient Rome's glory, its architecture, its roads, its aqueducts, remember what funded all of it. Not innovation, not productivity, not value creation. Extraction. Systematic, generational, legally enforced extraction from populations with no recourse and no escape. The marble temples were beautiful. The cost was everything else. That's the real conversion rate. Not sesterces to dollars, but understanding what wealth meant when it was entirely divorced from contribution. The 1% of ancient Rome didn't get rich by building a better mousetrap. They got rich by owning all the mice and charging rent for the privilege of being caught. So here's what you need to understand. Rome didn't collapse because of barbarians or moral decay. It collapsed because a system built entirely on extraction eventually runs out of things to extract. When wealth flows only upward, when every mechanism exists solely to concentrate resources in fewer hands, when survival itself becomes a rental agreement with the already rich, that's not civilization. That's a timer counting down to zero. The Roman elite were richer than today's billionaires, not despite their cruelty, but because of it. They understood something we pretend to forget. Unchecked wealth isn't earned, it's taken. And they took everything.